And so we started this project with Andrea and Harvey. And Harvey's been a professor at Georgia State for more years than
40 plus, let's say.
yeah, and he's been keeping a record of the process
You have
of the
the
city.
whole time.
And he's written a number of books about the city. But we thought what we're trying to do is make a curriculum on what happened in Atlanta that Georgia State can publish as a book. And we can do interviews and also do a film to accompany it.
Oh, good.
And make it available to other schools. I was in Detroit last month, and they were asking me, why did Atlanta do so well and Detroit have so much trouble? And I said, well, we had different kinds of folk, but it probably boiled down to the fact that organized labor and the black community got together, and they got so strong, they scared business out of town. And in Atlanta,
just scared them.
yeah, they just moved out. And in Atlanta, it was just the opposite. Labor was very conservative and almost racist back in the 50s and 60s. And the business community got together with the black community.
Yeah.
And that made all the difference, that we have stayed together, actually since Mayor Hartsfield.
Yeah.
But what we were trying to get to was the vision behind a lot of that came from the newspapers.
Well, that's nice to hear.
And, well, I forgot how many days they said Ralph McGill wrote 11,000 some odd columns. And he wrote a column every day for
Yeah.
I don't know how many years.
Oh, yes.
Over 30, yeah. Over 30.
Over 30 years. And a daily column.
Uh-huh.
But that would not have been possible. That was very controversial.
Oh, yes.
Except that you were behind the paper.
Well, it was Daddy who...
Yeah. Was he still alive when Ralph McGill started?
Oh, yes.
I did,
Yeah.
Anything you can tell us about what you remember about those early days? Even why did he come from Ohio to Atlanta and get involved with the newspapers in Atlanta and any of that? And you can help if you like too.
Oh, you can help a lot. Well,
Well, it was right between Dayton and Miami
yes, that's
where he was
right.
doing business, and I think he looked at it as the center of a lot of different things.
And he was interested and fascinated in the state as a whole. You know, he was a farmer, first of all, and he was interested in the whole state in that regard.
And what was the rumor? Wasn't there a rumor as to why he bought the paper?
Rumor. Oh, yes, yes. Because we came, well, I said, I came to Atlanta for the world premiere of Gone with the Wind, and I've never left. But no, the rumor was that he bought the newspaper to get seats to Gone with the Wind. That was it.
That's very good.
No, I was in school, and so Mother and Daddy came down, and it was, I think it was the end of November, maybe, and Mother called and said, get on the train tomorrow and come down. This is going to be the greatest spectacle you've ever seen. And I said, vacation doesn't start till next week or so. And she said, I don't give a damn. This is something not to be missed. So I've been here ever since.
Very good. So your mother had a lot of fire in her bones too.
Oh, yes. Oh, definitely.
Yeah, that's very good. And so that Gone with the Wind would have been
1939,
39.
December.
We found that Martin Luther King sang in a boys' choir at that premiere.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
And what age was he
he
then?
was about 6 or 7.
Wow, you saw that, honey.
What?
You saw that. You probably didn't even know.
Well, no.
That's amazing.
We didn't know.
I just listened to the nice music.
That is amazing.
That is amazing.
God.
That's
Yeah,
fantastic.
he was 10. He was born in 1929.
Okay.
So he was 10 years
He
old.
was 10 years
Yeah.
old.
Huh.
So he still had a little boy
Yeah.
voice.
Amazing.
But we did a film on Gone with the Wind and Dr. Mays.
Did you?
Yeah. Because Dr. Mays had a very quiet friendship with Margaret Mitchell.
Really?
And she ended up sending about 45 doctors to medical school.
Good heaven,
And
herself.
and she didn't want anybody to know it. So it was only on his deathbed that Dr. Mays told one of the doctors who had worried him all his life, how did I get through medical school? Who sent me to medical
He'd
school?
never known it.
None of them ever knew.
Goodness.
That's a film about that. You can take a look at that sometimes when you're on a plane and need something to. But
But that's a lovely story.
it really is, and she got a maid that was very close to her got tuberculosis, and she couldn't find care for her, and so she got Hugh Spalding from King and Spalding to start raising funds to build a hospital, because there was no hospital. I think she had tuberculosis, and there was no hospital in which she could be treated. So she didn't want her name on it, and they didn't think. Dr. Mays wanted Charles Drew, who developed the blood plasma, but they didn't think they could raise the money, and so they put Hugh Spalding's name on it. So that's how the Black Hospital got built.
Good heavens.
And I mean, this is stuff we're trying to dig up and to show that there's always been. Well, we have a reputation for being a very separate South, but there have been far more ties and friendships and relationships that have made a big difference in critical times.
Well, do you think that's more in Atlanta than other parts of the South?
I think so. There was
I think-
there was some of that in New Orleans where I grew up.
Uh-huh.
But that's been one of the lessons, and as we talk about it, you know, what we get from people from other major southern cities is that it is different. That Atlanta has percent of the intentional collaboration.
But she read Gone with the Wind when she was in high school, and I said, "What are you reading that for?" And the answer I got was that what's her name, Scarlett?
Scarlett.
Scarlett O'Hara was one of the first truly independent women, liberated women. That's what it
Yeah.
was. And so she was seeing Scarlett not as white owning a plantation so much as a strong woman who was liberated and not dependent on the men around her. She could run her plantation on her own.
Yeah, well, that's right. I'll never forget when she stood in the field and said, "I'll never be hungry again."
And didn't Margaret Mitchell, who was a writer for the paper,
Yeah.
when she came out on stage,
Yes.
Didn't she make a comment about
Oh,
Scarlett?
yeah, no, that was at the premiere, of course. It was Clark Gable was with Carol Lombard and Vivian Leigh and Laurence Olivier, these four most beautiful, glamorous people in the world. And Margaret, who was so small, of course, came out, and they all said something, and all she said was, "I'm so glad you like my Scarlett." There were lots of tears, but she was so totally self-effacing, wasn't she?
A wonderful writer.
You know, we were on a ranch, a dude ranch in Idaho the summer that the book came out, and a friend of Mother's from Atlanta sent her the book, and she made the mistake of saying this was the most remarkable book, and from then on, it was, everyone was stealing. You couldn't put it down for 5 minutes. Somebody'd grab it and go in another book, because you just couldn't stop reading it.
It also gave Atlanta an image to the rest of the world, to Europe and Japan. Any place that had been destroyed, look back to Atlanta, and
Yes.
I guess it's the second most publicized book in the world, second only to the Bible.
Yes. Yeah.
But she was a
But
reporter
think of that.
for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which means that your family gave her a way to produce it.
Well, good.
We'll take it.
We'll take it.
And what about your mother? I've known about your father, but I've never heard your mother talked about until you just said that get on down here to see this. This is more important.
Well, she was. She was totally self-effacing. I remember when she died, someone said to me that they lived in Dayton, Ohio, of course, all their married life, and someone said she was the most beloved woman in the city. It says, it sounds trite to say she was always doing good works, but she was.
On the day she died, wasn't she going to speak for John Kennedy?
Oh,
Wasn't she going
yes,
to a
and
campaign
she was very
Really?
modest, and she didn't. She was the opposite of Daddy, and she never made speeches. So I would call her usually on Sunday morning, and she said, "Oh, something terrible's going to happen today." When I said, "Well, how do you know? What do you mean? What's going to happen?" And she said, "I have to make a speech," because she admired Jack Kennedy so much, and so she had been asked to speak, and so she broke her silence, which had been really always for that, but well, she planned to, and she died in a fire in her house.
What was the story about Jack Kennedy's father seeking support for a?
Oh, well, yes. Daddy had no respect for Mr. Kennedy at all. He liked my sister. Went out with Jack Kennedy a lot before they both were married, but Daddy did not like Joe Kennedy, and so Mr. Kennedy called from Palm Beach and said he'd like to come down and see him. So Daddy said, "Okay, come down tomorrow and have lunch." So Daddy was getting tired of him after a little while, so he said, "Okay, Joe, what do you want to talk about?" And Mr. Kennedy said, I want to be president. And we had a Sealyham terrier named Whiskers who was lying just like that. Daddy pointed to Whiskers and said, you have just as much chance as Whiskers does of being, and got up and, goodbye, Joe.
That's quite a family.
Well, he was such an isolationist, and Jack Kennedy was so much more of a global thinker and more involved in the
Oh,
world.
yes, yeah, totally. In fact, when President Roosevelt asked Daddy to go to London as ambassador, and he said, I wouldn't put on knee breeches for anybody, but he would have been a terrible ambassador because you take all.
I was a terrible ambassador.
Well, you were not.
I wouldn't listen to the State Department.
No, that exactly. So then Mr. Kennedy became ambassador, and we read about all the Kennedy children living it up in London, and we were in Dayton, Ohio, my sister and I, so we had different views. But,
When did you first meet Andrew Young? Do you remember when
you used to come and stay at the embassy in
Well, I
Brussels.
did. That was later, but
Yeah,
I
that
think when I first ran for Congress in '72, and I'm not sure how it happened, but I thought we had a little something here for my campaign.
We did.
Yeah, and what I
did.
tried to do was I didn't believe you could get people's support on television or even in the newspapers, but we had everybody that I knew to invite a small group of their friends, little coffees or
Yeah.
teas, either 11 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'd come by and we'd just talk. And I think I came by here, and I don't know who encouraged you to, well, who was it? Well, Bill Schwartz, Fran and Stu Eisenstadt, and Clay Long, Jack Watson, Jack,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah,
All of them,
yeah.
actually, when I ran for Congress, Jack was considering running.
I do remember that.
And he decided not to run and to support me. And there was a fellow by the name of Alan Lowenstein who knew us both. And he talked to Jack. And Jack, I don't know, he might have been very relieved not to have to run. But he was very supportive of me and that whole group of young lawyers.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, he got good advice,
Yeah.
and he took it.
And we've
let
talked
his-
about it, saying that if I had not been in Congress, it would have been more difficult. That my being in Congress helped Jimmy Carter
Oh, no
get to the
question.
White House.
Oh, no
But it also
question.
helped him to become chief of staff at the White House.
So,
So we all
you
did well.
No,
Yeah.
of course it did, Lord.
Well, was Carter governor in
Yeah.
'72? So did you know President Carter before he moved into the governor's mansion, or shortly thereafter? How did you all meet?
We met that something that went, well, his mother, Miss Lillian, of
Yeah.
course, was a wonderful woman.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that was the first. It was something that she was.
I can see her walking across the street, knocking on the door.
Uh-huh.
She was a very, well, at 66, she went to
That's
the
right.
she went to the Peace Corps in India.
Yes.
So
That's
she
right.
must have been in her late 70s when he became governor.
Well, you were telling us the story about swimming pool or the tennis court?
But,
You were talking about how when they moved into the mansion.
oh, yes,
They-
so he said they had enough money for a tennis court or a swimming pool. So I said, well, we have a pool, so why don't you build the tennis court? So he used to come on Sunday afternoons with Amy, was about 5 then. And he'd come in his swimming trunks with Amy on his shoulders, and the police would stop the traffic, and they'd come and dive in the pool. And when I heard them, I'd leave them alone. I wouldn't go down there. So one Sunday, Rosalind called and said, Jimmy has something he wants to tell you. He would like to talk. Will you be home? And I said, yes, we would be. So, and you know, he was always very direct, no small talk. So he came and he said, I just want to tell you I'm going to run for president. And I guess I didn't respond immediately because he said, I guess you're going to ask the same thing my mother did, president of what?
So did you support him right away? Did you support him
Oh,
right
yes.
away?
Oh, goodness, yes.
Now, there was also another kind of intrigue. Who was it? Time magazine. What's his name? Started with an H. The editor of Time was friendly with Paul Austin.
I can't remember who that
And
was.
I was interviewed by a reporter from an English reporter, and they were talking about a New South, and they were planning to do the cover of Time with Jimmy Carter, Reuben Askew of Florida, and Dale Bumpers of Arkansas, and that was supposed to be their 3 pictures on the cover of Time
Yeah.
as representatives of the New South. And I don't know who did it, but you probably had something to do with it. That he flew up to have lunch with the editorial board. And I don't know who arranged that, but when he came back, the other 2 had dropped and he was on the front of Time by himself. And
That's a lovely story.
but that's sort of the kind of behind the scenes finagling that Atlantans are famous for.
Right.
And
And you think it's just the personalities that happened along? Well,
yeah,
you
no,
and
I think that,
just President Carter.
well, I never knew Mr. Woodruff. I knew Paul Austin and Don Keogh very well.
Yeah.
But somebody convinced him to have Carter up for lunch. And I understand he flew up to lunch, and the other 2 pictures just got dropped.
Really? So it was very simple.
Yeah. But it was simple things like that. He was asked in California about Zimbabwe, Azania, and Namibia in 1975, just before he started announced.
Yeah.
And nobody was talking about Africa in those terms. Those were the liberation movement
Yeah.
terms. And if they'd said Rhodesia and Southwest Africa and South Africa, he would have been comfortable, but it caught him off balance. And he said, I don't know, but I'm coming back and I'll give you my answer. So when he came back, by that time he'd figured out what they said, and he called me and asked me what is a good answer for that. And at that point, I didn't think he had a chance to be president. So I gave him a lot of the papers that, and magazines that our church statements put out, the Episcopal Church and the Presbyterian Church,
Yeah.
the Congregational Church, and all of the churches had statements. And then I gave them to him, and I said, but you know, the thing, you know more than anybody else about race and poverty, coming from South Georgia. And I said, whatever was good for you in Georgia would be good for Africa. And he started saying the vote, one man, one vote, and democracy. and it caught on. And I think,
So you got him started on.
well, on Africa, and that's the reason he brought me to the UN.
Yeah,
And
of course.
and you went to Brussels.
Yeah, then you used to come and spend the night on your way
Yep.
to whatever country.
Because
you were.
I found that, and I don't think they do this now. I don't think America should relate to Africa without showing respect for the old colonial powers. Because they get very upset if they don't know what's going on.
Sure.
And so I always insisted on talking to the British and the Belgians and the French about what we were doing. And that's why your place was the hub of activity.
And that's why you were there so often, knowing it was very much appreciated.
And then you were ambassador when Brussels had its 1000th anniversary,
Yes.
and we were celebrating our 150th
Yeah.
about the same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
How long was King Leopold in power?
What?
How long was King Leopold around?
Oh, he wasn't there,
Going to the 20th
and
century?
I was not allowed to meet him.
Okay,
No.
that was kind of off limits.
No, it was
Too controversial, I guess.
King Baudouin was there when and Queen Fabiola, who was a wonderful lady, very religiously. But no, Brussels was, and then Tap Bennett, who
Yep.
was our ambassador to NATO. He, of course, had originally come from Georgia,
yeah.
so I had known him not terribly well, but he really taught me how to be an ambassador.
Well, he taught me a lot too.
Did he?
Yeah.
Tapley Bennett.
Yeah.
What was it like? Had not many women had been ambassadors at that point. So how was that? How was that for you to
No,
be an
that
ambassador?
was, it was unusual. Let's see, I'm trying to think. I think it was the King of Spain, the King of Spain and the Queen, and they came, and there was a diplomatic reception, of course, and so all of the ambassadors were lined up to be introduced, and then the spouses behind. So I was the only woman ambassador. So all the other wives, stood behind. So the king and queen came, and we were presented, and the queen went a few places beyond me, and she turned around and looked, and she came back and she said, "So you're the ambassador?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Good for you." No, it was a wonderful part of my life. I think I probably wouldn't have my place in the country in France if I hadn't lived there for those. Now I'm a farmer in France. I was born on a farm, and I've gone back to one.
The farm was outside of Dayton,
Yeah, Jacksonsburg.
Jacksonsburg.
Yeah, her grandparents are still buried there.
What?
I was saying we found your grandparents' tombstones.
Yes,
They were broken, and I had them put back together.
that's right. In the little tiny church. And
That's right. When I first went there were peonies that were blooming around the side of the house. And I said, God, that's so pretty. I wonder who's been planting peonies. There hadn't been anyone in this house in 50 plus years. And I asked the caretaker, and he said they've just always been there. And he'd been there for 50 years. And so I called my grandmother and said, do you recall somebody planting these peonies? And she thought for about a minute or two and she said, I planted those with my sister and my mother 70 years ago when Barbie's husband passed away.
uh-huh.
You all went there to mourn, I guess, for a few months and planted the pretty
Yeah.
flowers that are still there.
Yeah, they are.
Amazing.
They do very well in that climate.
Yeah. And then she cut some, and we went to her grandparents' tombstones, and it said Gilbert Cox, born and died. And then it said for his wife, who was Eliza. It didn't say Eliza Cox. It just said wife of Cox. And she looked at those two things and kind of considered it, and then just put the flowers on her tombstone. I thought that was funny.
Well, I was named for my aunt, Daddy's older sister, and her husband, Uncle John, owned the newspaper in Middletown, Ohio, and that was the first paper that Daddy worked on.
That was a famous town. Everybody had to read in sociology a little study from Middletown, Ohio.
Really?
When I was in school. It was the center of American youth culture.
Yeah.
And in the Protestant churches, that was sort of a handbook of, and I think one thing I remember from it was that they discovered that 30% of the teen population belonged to everything. And the same ones that were Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts went to church, and they were, in the social circles, but there were 70% of the young people in Middletown, Ohio, had no connection with any religious or secular institution other than the public school. And
Good.
I think in those days we were trying to get churches to put more time in helping young people.
Uh-huh.
And that was sort of the documentation of the fact that that because of this, the 70% who were independent of the
Yeah.
church and their families
Yeah.
tended to develop their own youth culture, which most of the elders didn't think was so healthy, because that was when young people started adopting the blues and jazz and
Yeah, sure. Right at
yeah.
the start of that.
So that was where your first paper was, Middletown.
No, that wasn't. That was my aunt's husband.
Okay. Hmm.
First one was in Dayton Daily News. The Dayton Daily News was the first one. Another interesting piece of history I was just thinking about is Coca-Cola. So for a long time in France, they just called you Madame Coca-Cola. That's just because you were from Atlanta and you were on the board of Coca-Cola. How did that happen? Who was the chairman of Coca-Cola, and who recruited you, and how did that all work out? When I was a kid, you used to have all the marketing videos on Betamax, all the new commercials coming out, and I'd come and watch them and drink Coke in those little bottles you had. Do you recall all that? Who was the chairman?
Oh,
I can't remember right now.
No, it was Don Kehoe, and who was the other one?
Goswetta, Roberto Goswetta.
It was before.
Before Don Kehoe, I
Don
think,
Kehoe.
was Paul Austin.
Exactly, that was
Yeah.
it, yes.
That was another thing that I thought was interesting about Atlanta, that Paul Austin had been running Coca-Cola in South Africa
Yes.
in the 40s when they introduced apartheid. And he came back, and as a Georgian from LaGrange, he was determined that Atlanta would not go the way of South Africa. So somewhere along there in the very early 60s, I think it was Coca-Cola that came up with the slogan, a city too busy to hate.
To hate, yeah, that's right.
And I asked Ovid Davis, who was the other? There was a woman by the name of Helen Bullard. Did you remember her?
Helen,
Bullard.
I remember the
Yeah.
name, I can't remember
But
what job she had.
yeah, she was with the public.
Well, she worked with Hartsfield.
She worked with Mayor
She was
Hartsfield,
one of
that's
the
right.
First political
Works for
operatives in
him.
Atlanta. But as a woman on the Coca-Cola board, I mean, that was again another first, another very unusual. Do you remember how that happened? That you came to be on
What
the-
happened?
how you-
How you came to be on the board of Coca-Cola?
I honestly, many good things happened because of my having been an ambassador.
Yeah.
I don't think if that had been part that I would have been asked. It was at that moment, boards were thinking of asking maybe one woman or at the most to join the board. And I just benefited from from the timing. But I've said once the only thing I did that Daddy was really proud of, I became a member of the Peachtree Garden Club because my mother-in-law had been a member. And so I then became president. I was in my 20s, president of Peachtree Garden Club. So I remember Daddy saying, "I'm having lunch with Bob Woodruff tomorrow, and I can't wait to tell him that my daughter is the first Yankee to ever be president of the Peachtree Garden Club." I said that's the only thing I did that he was proud of.
Tell us a little bit about your role in the arts and support of the arts here in Atlanta. The High Museum. And
Yes. Goodness how, yes, we started, a little group of us started the Forward Arts Foundation because what was it we wanted to do? We wanted to, it was something about Swan House, and there was a group of businessmen who were preventing us from doing it. So we, 12 ladies, got together and we raised the money, and and it became the Forward Arts Foundation. And so the group of men who didn't like us named us the Dirty Dozen. So we were quite proud of that. But I think I'm the only one still around from that. Elkin Alston was.
And this was after the Orly plane crash.
This was 1965.
The Orly plane crash was earlier.
Okay.
I think it was
Yeah, the
just
Forward
about-
Arts Foundation was 1965. I just
Ivan
looked
Allen
at.
was mayor during the Orly plane crash.
Was he?
Ivan Allen, yeah.
Did you know anyone on the Orly plane crash?
Oh, heavens, yes.
Yeah.
Goodness, yes. I remember just that Sunday afternoon just going from house to house. And my Jim, our son, was a little boy. He was maybe 6 years old, and one of his friends was Baxter Jones, whose parents were on the crash. He had been staying with his aunt and uncle. So he came to stay with us for a couple of days, and it got dark the first night, and I went around looking for him, and I found him out in back of the house. So I said, "Oh, Baxter, come on in. It's getting dark, or it's supper time, or what are you doing back here?" And he said, I'll never forget this. He said, "I'm making a wish. I'm wishing on a star, but it's a wish that can't come true." No, I mean, it was everybody in this
It
whole
was
part of town. You just
almost
went from
150
one house.
of the
Yeah.
lead. It was a charter,
Yes.
and so it was 150 or so of the leading art patrons of the city. It was really tragic.
So, goodness.
But also in the gardening, you were probably one of the founders of Trees Atlanta. Were you?
No,
No,
I think, isn't Jim Kennedy involved in that?
In what? I'm sorry.
Trees Atlanta,
I don't know. I have to check.
I think so.
I'm not sure.
He has done a wonderful job with Path,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
and I think the Beltline is probably one of the most creative urban park developments that of modern times.
Well, you
but-
have to remember to tell Jimmy.
Oh, yeah.
The mayor said that, no, I agree.
Absolutely.
He's always getting on me about not sending my dues because I'm a member of Path.
You're a board member.
I'm a board member. I was a board member, and I
They
said,
wouldn't make you an honorary member
Well-
with no new
That's
dues?
what you should ask for.
no, I.
And I spend more time on the path trails.
But she has become a cyclist, and my knees have gotten the best of me. But I may try again this summer.
Yeah, we're gonna get you back
Well,
out.
With
I
the
think
bicycle.
you should be an honorary member with no dues.
We're gonna write and say
Oh,
that
really?
you said that. One of the things that we have found again in Atlanta is the generosity in terms of philanthropy, and you've always been a leader in that area. What, you talk about your mother, but what is the sort of source? What is it that really prompts you to give?
That what, I can't hear very
Yeah.
Well,
Well, I was just saying why she's so generous, why she's so giving, to so many, she
What,
supports.
my mother?
well, she was basically saying that you're so philanthropic. Were your parents philanthropic?
Oh, yes.
Is that something you learned?
Totally. That's just the way it always was.
What was your father interested in philanthropically? Do you remember particular things?
Well, no, I remember, Daddy ran the,
Certainly public service, yeah.
yeah, but Mother did, Oakwood, of course, was the,
Historical preservation and that kind of
yeah,
thing. Yeah.
and helping, I forgot, she and two friends started a organization called the Little Exchange that was modeled on the Women's Exchange in Chicago, which was helping young women who had talents, but no way to use them. And people, they sewed and painted and did all sorts of creative things that were sold in this shop. It may still be going, I don't know.
And you've always loved, there's been a couple of things over the years connecting France to Atlanta with the High Museum, for example, when the Louvre came here with a big exhibit. And you were a big supporter of that with Michael Shapiro.
Yes. Well, that was the Louvre.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we also had an art exchange right after you came back. Toulouse
Oh, goodness.
and Atlanta
That's right.
had they financed it. They came and selected art from Atlanta
Yeah.
and brought it to Toulouse and Lyon and Paris.
That's right.
And they sponsored it, and in exchange we hosted Toulouse artists here.
And they were
Yeah.
saying they were sister cities.
Yeah, we was. Now we got to. Did you know how we got to be sister cities with Toulouse? Do you have that? Maynard Jackson's mother got her PhD in French from Toulouse, University in Toulouse.
Goodness.
And his father was a Baptist minister, and he went over to Toulouse and proposed to her in Toulouse, and they married in Toulouse.
Really?
Yeah. And when we became sister cities, and I went over there for that art exhibition,
Yeah.
there was the city hall in Toulouse had a big hall, a big open space. And I said, why, well, they said that there were no country clubs and there were no big hotels. So City Hall had to provide a big meeting space for weddings and important events for the city. So when I came back from Toulouse, I got the architect who was working, we were building a City Hall annex, the new City Hall. And I told him that we needed to have a big public space where there could be receptions and weddings and things for citizens who couldn't afford
Yeah.
hotels or
Yeah.
country clubs. And it has worked very well for us.
So it's been a good
Yeah.
sister city
It has.
connection.
I don't know what we taught them, but
Well, whatever, it
Yeah.
worked.
actually the mayor of Toulouse almost became prime minister of France, and I can't remember his name.
Really?
Yeah.
How long
And remember,
ago was-
Mitterrand came here to visit us after you got back,
Yeah.
and I think we had about almost 200 French companies move here,
Yes.
and during your time, a lot of I can't remember the name of it, but it was a Belgian supermarket chain that came in and started buying up the supermarkets. But we got very good investment from Belgium as a result of
Yes.
your building a relationship. And what was a Belgian airline?
Sabina.
Sabina. Sabina was the first
Yeah.
foreign carrier to come into Atlanta.
It was the first,
Yeah.
that's right, and that happened right
And
at
then
that time.
British Caledonia and KLM.
Came after that.
Yeah, and then I went to Swiss Air and Japan Air and got them in. And then we began to take off internationally.
Oh, yes. Goodness. Well, yes, and that really did it. The airlines didn't it? I mean, made the difference in what kind of city it was.
At first, Delta didn't want to be, they didn't want international competition. I remember them telling me that we're a regional airline with a few national routes. We have no intention of going international.
Imagine.
And that was right after while I was running for mayor.
What, before, yeah.
Yeah, and so, but the chamber had decided that they wanted to bring in international routes. So I think I went, one of the first trips was to go to Belgium and Holland
Yes.
and
I
bring
re-
KLM and
Yeah.
Sabina here,
Yeah.
and then Delta kind of realized they had to keep pace with the
Well,
competition.
of course. And I remember someone at that time saying, all the talk about the airlines, to get to heaven, you must change planes in Atlanta. Probably heard that a million times.
And it's still true.
Honey, over the years, so Ralph McGill, who was a pro-segregation when he was young, and then as he got older, he realized that the old ways of the South weren't going to work anymore, and he started writing a lot about kind of the new South and exposing a lot of the demons of the old. And then in the AJC, or the Atlanta Journal, was a big force in kind of writing about some of the darkest things of segregation and racism. And then over the years, Monica Kaufman, the anchor woman for so many years on WSB TV,
Oh, goodness, yes.
was one of the first black big personalities on TV. And people who run the newspapers and TV always say that it was because of the support of the family that they were allowed to do that. Do you recall the controversy and people?
Oh, well, I remember how many people just couldn't read a word of Ralph McGill's columns. I mean, it provoked intense emotions.
I think
and the fact of putting the column on the front page was an unusual thing to do. Normally he would have been on the editorial page, but to put it smack on the front, you couldn't miss it.
Did it have something to do with your father being a progressive politician that made the family just more likely to not care so much about changing things?
I just think it was his being a newspaper man.
Yeah, that's probably true.
But Ohio and Ohio State University had always had a reputation for being a very progressive state
Yes.
in those days, and it was probably the heart of the New Deal, and still is. As of the last election, it probably saved us.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
I never
That
knew
is
this. When
true.
I was there, though, there are some amazing characters that have lived in Dayton for a long time that told me about the race riots in Dayton. They said they were very, very significant. I never knew that.
Yes,
Dayton,
that's
Ohio.
right.
Never would have thought
That's
of that.
right.
Now, I just wonder what did it mean to him to be a newspaper man? I mean, what did it mean to him, to your dad,
Well, I
to be
can't.
a newspaper?
What did it mean to your father to be a newspaper man? Why was he why did he feel so strongly about newspapers?
I just remember someone asked him, I guess sort of asked the same thing, and he said it just never occurred to him to be in any other business. Well, as I say, my Aunt Ann, who lived in Middletown, Ohio, was married to Uncle John, who owned that newspaper. And that's where Daddy started. And then he worked on the Cincinnati Enquirer after that.
And by the time he had,
Cincinnati, of course, was such a Republican city. It was the seat of the Taft family.
Yeah. You mentioned the choice, the choice of Monica Kaufman. The competition for her, for that job, was Jane Pauley and Oprah Winfrey.
Good heavens.
And they chose Monica.
Yeah.
And Oprah tells the story of feeling like this was her big break. And when she did not get it,
Oprah's real.
Oprah, yeah. and she was in Baltimore. And that's when she and Maya Angelou became good, really close, because she said after being rejected, she was on the floor of the bathroom crying. And Maya Angelou called, not knowing what was going on. And she said Maya's first words were, "Wait a minute, child. Before you tell me what you're crying about, let's pray and thank God for this trouble."
Good heavens.
And Oprah says that I'm going to thank God for this misery. And so when Maya got through praying,
Yeah.
it was clear to Oprah that what Maya said was that this just was not for you, that God has something else in store for you. And then she went to Chicago and took off. But still, every time she sees Monica, she says to Monica,
remembers that.
"You took my job." And Monica's answer is always the same: "Okay, I'll trade."
Well, and Oprah sometimes says, but it looks like things worked out for both of us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's very true.
Yeah.
No, that's.
But that was a very courageous move at the time, and
wasn't it?
she had the perfect personality
Yes.
to get along with everybody.
Yeah. Well, yes, and that's quite unique.
Yeah.
The story, as I've heard it, is that she had authenticity, which was she didn't do anything that anybody told her to do, but it somehow carried through on the television. She was a real person you could connect to.
That's
Very much so.
seems to me that's the key to education and business and everything else.
Authenticity.
Everything else.
Yeah, authenticity. You've got to come across as real.
Yeah. Well, yes, because if you're not real, it's going to come out
Yeah.
sooner or later. But you learned so much so early.
Well, I was blessed.
Did you have good guidance?
I did, and I was born in New Orleans, and right in the middle of the block, in fact, right around the corner where the Cox station was on Canal Street.
Yeah.
I lived one block behind that on Cleveland Avenue, but on the corner, right one block behind the Cox station during the war. Well, I was born in 1932, so back then, the Nazi Party headquarters was on that corner.
Good heavens.
Yeah, and there was an Italian bar and an Irish grocery store,
Very international.
and I lived in the middle. And it was a working class neighborhood, but I say that my father took me to the movies to see Jesse Owens. And he always said that, talking about the Nazis and white supremacy, he always said racism is a sickness. And he was a dentist. And he said, you don't get mad with sick people. You find a way to help them.
Goodness.
And he said, don't ever get mad. If you get angry in a fight, you lose the fight. And his mantra was, don't get mad, get smart. So your mind is the most powerful weapon you have.
So that came from him.
Yeah, at 4 years old. I mean, he took me to that movie, which was 1936, and it was probably where the seed for the Olympics was planted, because I was a Jesse Owens fan.
Were you?
Because Jesse Owens won the race, the first race, and Hitler got up and walked out of the stadium rather than give him the medal.
Yeah.
And my father said, but Jesse didn't get mad. He just went on and won 3 more gold medals.
Well, yes.
Yeah. And so that was always the way you disproved racism. You didn't fight it. You had to help people.
But that was wonderful
It was really true.
training and
Very much so.
advice for you.
It was. So when I went to Birmingham or even in South Africa, I never was uncomfortable with the Afrikaners.
Yeah,
And I just got back from Zimbabwe yesterday morning,
good heavens.
and the State Department asked me to deliver a letter to Mugabe to the effect that we want to end the boycott, and but we need to have a free and fair election with no violence, and we're prepared to end sanctions if they can produce that before the end of the year. And I delivered a letter from Secretary Kerry. So it looks like that's the
Who's the man
You
he's supposed to be
think it
sharing
may happen?
responsibility with?
Morgan Shangarai.
Shanghai, that's right.
But for some, the New York Times really took Shangarai apart last week
Yeah.
because he really isn't strong enough. I mean, Mugabe is a devout Roman Catholic, but I say Roman Catholics who become political leaders, their model for authority is the Pope.
Well, sure. No, sure.
And they want to rule ex cathedra, and they gather people around them that are going to not criticize them. And so, but I always got along with him because I would say that to him very well. I'd always quote to him the parts of the Bible that he said, everybody should sell all that they have and give it to the poor. I said, yeah, but, who's going to run it? Who's going to make it work?
And how did he answer that?
Well, he
Didn't. Probably.
didn't, but he would always provoke me and argue with me.
Well, that was a compliment.
Yeah, there was a Roman Catholic Monsignor that came to visit me right after I got to the UN, saying that the U.S. is making a mistake to ignore him, that if there is a free and fair election, he will probably win 60% of the vote, because he said he's the most organized and disciplined person I know. And he won 64% of the vote when the British ran the election.
Yeah, that was absolutely right.
But there was a problem there, and we put on sanctions because they shut down the press and they were beating up the opposition, some of the soldiers, and so we put sanctions on Zimbabwe, but they didn't hurt him, and they didn't hurt the government. And what it did was, I mean, Zimbabwe is a very rich nation, and
Yeah.
it opened the door for the Chinese and the Indians to take over all the resources, and we're trying to. And what I didn't know was that Zimbabwe had more diamonds than South Africa or Botswana.
Really?
But Harry Oppenheimer actually controlled 478,000 hectares of land. And but they didn't want to mine diamonds there because they wanted to keep the price high. And they were so the people really wanted the farmland. They didn't know anything about the diamonds, and they weren't interested in mining. So they worked out a deal. I think Anglo-American kept 278,000 hectares and gave 200,000 hectares of land for farmers. And they have been working out some of the problems. And an agricultural enterprise like Cargill never really pulled out.
They didn't.
No, they continue to supply the farmers with seeds and equipment because it is such a valuable land.
Mm-hmm.
But it's what Coca-Cola did in South Africa. They didn't pull out either.
No, not at all.
They turned the bottling over to a South African brewery, which was
Yeah.
black owned, and they gave the profits of the company to a trust set up by Bishop Tutu to help the poor. And during the last 10 years of apartheid, Coca-Cola didn't take anything out, but it was reinvesting in.
And think how smart that was.
That was really.
One of the many smart things they've done, obviously.
I'm taking your time.
Well,
It's,
We want to hear what you have to say.
no, it's a pleasure.
well,
More
one
than a
question.
pleasure, an honor to have you in my house.
Well,
Uh,
I always enjoy your parties because if it's the right time of the year, you have my favorite delicacy, which is stone crabs.
Goodness,
And it's the only place in town where I've ever been to a reception where they serve stone crabs.
we had them for dinner 2 nights ago. If I'd known, I would have called you.
That's okay.
Really, you love stone crabs?
Well, because
Oh,
Martin Luther King took me to Joe's Stone Crab.
way down on
Down
the end of Miami
when it was a shack not much bigger
Yeah,
than this.
that's exactly
Yeah.
right. No, we used to go there when we were children,
Joe's
all the
Stone
way
Crab?
down at the end of Miami Beach.
That's funny.
Yeah, that was the biggest, oh, well, there's nothing better.
Nothing better.
Well, we always.
Well, if I can.
You want to swap seats with me for a minute,
Well,
so
I just.
she can hear.
Is that,
Your voice doesn't carry as well.
You okay?
I'll just look.
There you go.
Thank you. We just really appreciate your time and
Oh, heavens, as I say, not just a pleasure, an honor to have this.
one thing we always ask is what advice you give for people who are leaders of Atlanta today and tomorrow. You know, what would be your advice to students in the future?
To leaders of the future. Well, I would urge them to continue the legacy of Atlanta and to think about and remember those things that made Atlanta the great city that it is in the first place. But then whoever's coming along is hopefully going to have some ideas of their own.
And any special idea, any important message of what the legacy is? Or what you're most proud of about Atlanta?
Perhaps the spirit of tolerancy. And again, I mean, look at the history. Dr. King and our friend right here. I mean, has been given to us. So I think to maintain and be sure that continues as strongly as it has been. I mean,
It's very, very.
other cities don't have that.